even if the tariffs went no further than right now, to what extent are supply chains already being scrambled?
Oh, they're definitely already being scrambled. I mean, if you think about it, when the tariffs went up, retailers had already placed orders that were coming in, and some were on ships, some weren't on ships. They're now, as Anna said, placing orders. So you're talking about retailers, and also, if you think about it, over 50% of what the U.S. imports are actually inputs to other, like manufacturing. So those supply chains have been scrambled because those costs are going to be dramatically impacted if those products are coming from China. For a period of time, the tariffs went way up from inputs from other countries. Those now, the president said, will go up in July. That certainly isn't enough time for companies to readjust, major companies, major manufacturers, to adjust their supply chains. And for small and medium-sized companies, they are just dead in the water. Are their margins of sales sufficient to make it worthwhile even to pay the tariffs when their products land?
Well, so when we consider the prospect of what it's going to take to bring these tariffs down, presumably negotiations will need to start at some point. President Trump has contended multiple times in recent days that there are ongoing conversations with China. China says no such thing is happening, and there's been no, at least, record of Xi Jinping picking up the phone to call the president. With your experience dealing with trade in the Bush administration, and obviously China has evolved much since then, but who do you think ultimately is going to be forced to blink first here when you're considering the positions of the U.S. relative to Beijing?
Well, in terms of China and the U.S., I would be pretty confident that there are conversations going on. Now, I couldn't tell you between who and who, but the fact that you've had the IMF, World Bank conferences going on in the D.C. area this week, it is almost impossible for me to imagine the Secretary of Treasury not somehow running into the Chinese finance minister and their respective teams interacting. A lot of these multilateral conferences or regional conferences, the most important thing that goes on are the side meetings. So I'd be very surprised if those encounters haven't taken place someplace, or in Geneva at the WTO. I can't tell you how in-depth those conversations have been. I couldn't begin to tell you whether the president and Xi Jinping have talked. Ideally, a lot of groundwork would be laid before that conversation would take place.
Yeah. Well, we're getting a lot of reality checks on this week, right? Framework is one thing, conversations another, a trade deal is a very different thing than that. And we talked about it today on the early edition of Balance of Power with Christopher Smart, managing partner at Arbroath Group, and what he had to say about the status of these ongoing trade talks. Listen.
Investors mostly expect that if we're going to have some agreement this quickly, these are trade agreements that are very complicated and take months and years to really negotiate and hammer out. But if we're going to come down, if we're going to strike a deal very quickly, it means it's going to be something of less substance.
Is that how this ends, Susan? We race to the finish with little to show for it?
I think it depends on what the asks are. I mean, we've had such a dramatic list of asks or potential asks on the part of the Trump administration, right? So the president on April 2nd waived the National Trade Estimate report, pointing out that there are, in fact, some serious grievances that the U.S. has in terms of market access, in terms of various unfair regulations, digital services taxes, that kind of thing that show up that we would like to see eliminated. Then they have their reindustrialization objectives. They have their use of tariffs to raise revenue objectives. They have a whole variety of objectives. Then there are some who believe that you could actually close bilateral trade deficits through trade agreements. That the economics on that are seriously questionable. But depending on what it would take to declare victory, you could see a package that has some barrier reductions, that has some purchase agreements, that perhaps has some companies from that country saying they're going to invest in the U.S. But the real kicker, it seems to me, is what will that country or that group of countries be willing and able to tolerate on the U.S. side. And what makes this so sticky or so hard for me to imagine closure is what the U.S. is offering is nothing, or worse than nothing from their perspective. What the U.S. is offering is we won't raise our tariffs as high as we threatened to do on April 2nd, but we're probably going to keep them, or we're probably going to make them 10% higher than they already are, meaning that the counterparty, the trading partner, would have to explain at home how they would have less access to the U.S. market in exchange for making concessions. And I see that as really, really hard to get done on the part of virtually all of our trading partners. So what will it take for the U.S. side to declare victory? I think they're going to have to sort through all of the objectives they've articulated and see which ones really are the most important to them.
Well, you just alluded there, Ambassador, to the changes we have seen just in the last few weeks to the approach for tariffs, from that high threatened reciprocal rate, taking it down to that 10% baseline. That's after we've threatened tariffs on countries that were delayed or eliminated entirely prior to that. Does that mean that the U.S. has lost some credibility, some leverage in these conversations? Why would any country believe that the tariff would go back up if they don't agree to everything the U.S. wants?
Well, I think it's safe to say the administration sort of over-rotated on April 2nd. I mean, the fact is they shot the hostage. And once you've shot the hostage, you're in a very different negotiating position. That said, I think most of our trading partners would like to see some normalization of bilateral trade and, geopolitical relations with us. Hopefully, we'll be able to bring, ideally, we can bring on board some of our trading partners that are experiencing the same challenges we are vis-a-vis China and address some of those issues so we're not seeing circumvention issues with China, and then perhaps see a normalization of a strained relationship with China, somehow normalized in a trade agreement. It's doable, but it's not doable in 90 days.